The morning sun cast a warm glow through the large windows of La Maison, one of Atlanta's most prestigious restaurants. Sarah Thompson, a 68-year-old retired school teacher, stood outside the elegant establishment, smoothing down her carefully chosen powder blue dress. Her silver hair was neatly styled, and a simple pearl necklace, a gift from her son on her 60th birthday, adorned her neck. After spending the morning at her weekly book club, Sarah had decided to treat herself to a nice lunch. She rarely visited such upscale restaurants alone, usually saving these occasions for when her son Marcus could join her. But today felt different. Maybe it was the inspiring discussion about Maya Angelou's poetry at the book club, or perhaps it was simply the beautiful spring weather that made her feel particularly confident. As she pushed open the heavy glass door, the cool air-conditioned breeze welcomed her. The hostess, a young woman named Emma, looked up from her tablet with a practiced smile. "Good afternoon, ma'am. Table for one." Sarah nodded politely. "Yes, please." Her voice carried the gentle warmth that had made her such a beloved teacher for over 4 decades at Washington High School. Emma led her through the restaurant, past tables of business executives in sharp suits and ladies in designer outfits enjoying their lunch meetings. Sarah couldn't help but notice she was being led to a corner section, far from the restaurant center. It was a common occurrence she had grown accustomed to over the years, being seated in less visible areas despite plenty of open tables in better locations. As she settled into her seat, Sarah placed her small purse beside her and accepted the menu from Emma. The leather-bound menu felt heavy in her hands as she began to browse through the carefully curated selection of French-inspired dishes. The prices were steep, but Sarah had always believed in treating herself occasionally. After all, she had worked hard her entire life, raising her son alone while maintaining a full-time teaching career. From her corner table, Sarah had a good view of the restaurant's operations. She watched as servers moved efficiently between tables, offering warm smiles and attentive service to other diners. 5 minutes passed, then 10. She noticed a young waitress, whose name tag read Rachel, serving nearby tables with enthusiasm, yet seemingly avoiding eye contact with her section. A few more minutes ticked by. Sarah pulled out her reading glasses to study the menu more closely, though she had already decided on the salmon with herb butter sauce. Her son had mentioned it was one of their signature dishes. The thought of Marcus brought a smile to her face. He had come so far from the little boy who used to stand on a stool in their small kitchen, helping her cook dinner. Finally, after 15 minutes, Rachel approached her table. The waitress's demeanor was noticeably different from what Sarah had observed with other customers. Her smile was forced, her tone clipped. "What can I get you?" she asked, without the usual pleasantries or water service that Sarah had seen offered to other tables. "Good afternoon," Sarah responded warmly, choosing to lead by example. "I would love a glass of water to start, and I have a few questions about the menu if you don't mind." Rachel's posture stiffened slightly. "The menu descriptions are pretty clear," she replied, her tone carrying a hint of impatience. "But what questions do you have?" Sarah maintained her composure, even as she noticed a couple at the next table receiving detailed recommendations and friendly chat from the same waitress just moments ago. She had encountered such treatment countless times in her life, and experience had taught her that maintaining dignity was the best response. "I'm interested in the salmon," Sarah said calmly. "Is the herb butter sauce very rich?" "It's fine," Rachel responded curtly, shifting her weight from one foot to another. "Do you want that then?" Sarah nodded, folding her menu and holding it out. "Yes, please, and that glass of water when you have a moment." As Rachel walked away with barely a nod, Sarah took a deep breath and glanced around the beautiful restaurant. If only the young waitress knew who she was serving today. But more importantly, if only she understood that every person, regardless of their skin color, deserved to be treated with basic human dignity and respect. Little did Rachel know, her actions today would set in motion events that would change not only her life, but the entire restaurant's culture forever. Rachel Miller stormed into the kitchen, her face twisted with obvious annoyance. She grabbed her notepad and aggressively scribbled the order for table 23. The other servers noticed her change in demeanor, but most stayed quiet, familiar with her pattern of behavior whenever she served minority customers. "Everything okay, Rachel?" asked Tom, another waiter who was arranging bread baskets near the kitchen entrance. "Just peachy," she muttered, slamming a glass under the water dispenser. Got stuck with another one of those people who probably can't even afford to be here. She glanced through the kitchen window at Sarah, who sat patiently reading a small book she had pulled from her purse. In the background, the kitchen bustled with its usual lunchtime energy. Pots clanged, chefs' voices called out orders, and the smell of various dishes filled the air. The head chef wasn't present on the line today, which was unusual, but the sous chef assured everyone he'd be in later. "Order for table 23, Rachel called out, clipping the ticket to the order line. "And take your time with it. No rush," she smirked, then grabbed the water glass she had filled and headed back to the dining room. As she approached Sarah's table, Rachel's steps slowed deliberately. She had already served 3 other tables their main courses while making Sarah wait for even a simple glass of water. When she finally reached the table, she placed the water down without a word, some of it slushing over the side. "Thank you," Sarah said kindly, reaching for a napkin to dab at the spilled water. Her dignified response only seemed to irritate Rachel more. "Your food will be ready when it's ready," Rachel snapped, turning on her heel before Sarah could respond. Back in the kitchen, Rachel busied herself with her other tables, providing them with stellar service. She chatted warmly with a young white couple celebrating their anniversary, recommended wine pairings to a group of businessmen, and even brought complimentary bread to a family with children. Meanwhile, Sarah's salmon sat under the heat lamp, ready to be served. Rachel purposely left it there, pretending to be too busy with other tables to deliver it. The food runner, Jason, noticed and started to pick up the plate. "I'll take that," Rachel said sharply, stopping him. "It's my table." After making Sarah wait another 10 minutes, Rachel finally picked up the plate. But before heading out, she glanced around quickly. The kitchen was busy, and most staff members were focused on their tasks. In a moment of pure hatred and prejudice, she did something unthinkable. She quickly spat into the sauce on the side of the plate. What Rachel didn't notice was that young Jason, the food runner, had seen everything from his position by the dessert station. His eyes widened in shock, but fear kept him silent. He was new to the job and needed it badly to help pay for his college tuition. As Rachel carried the contaminated dish to Sarah's table, she wore a satisfied smirk. She placed the plate down roughly, causing some of the sauce to splash onto the white tablecloth. "Here's your salmon," she said, not bothering to describe the dish as she did for other customers. "Anything else?" Sarah looked at the plate, then up at Rachel with kind eyes that held years of wisdom and patience. "No, thank you," she replied softly. "This looks lovely." For a brief moment, something flickered across Rachel's face, perhaps a hint of shame or doubt, but she quickly suppressed it. She turned away without another word, leaving Sarah alone with the tampered food. From across the restaurant, other diners had begun to notice the disparity in service. A few shook their heads in disapproval, while others whispered among themselves, but no one spoke up or intervened. Little did Rachel know, her actions were about to catch up with her in a way she never expected. The restaurant's security cameras had captured everything, and a much bigger surprise was waiting in the wings. The head chef's absence from the kitchen that day wasn't just a coincidence. He was in a meeting with the restaurant group's board members, one of whom had a very special connection to the elegant woman sitting alone at table 23. The events that would unfold in the next hour would shake the foundation of Rachel's world and force her to confront her own prejudices in the most unexpected way. Marcus Miller stood in the executive boardroom on the top floor of Le Maison, wrapping up his quarterly presentation to the restaurant group's board members. At 45, he had worked his way up from a dishwasher to become one of the most respected executive chefs in Atlanta. His innovative fusion menu had earned Le Maison its prestigious 3-star rating. "And that concludes our financial overview for this quarter," Marcus said, adjusting his crisp white chef's coat. "Any questions?" The board members shook their heads, clearly impressed with the restaurant's performance. Just as the meeting was about to end, Marcus's phone buzzed. It was a text from Jason, the young food runner he had mentored since hiring him 6 months ago. "Chef, something bad happened in the kitchen. You need to see the security footage ASAP. It involves your mom." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. He knew his mother sometimes came in for lunch, but he hadn't expected her today. Excusing himself quickly, he rushed to the security office, his mind racing with possibilities. The security officer, Mike, was already reviewing the footage when Marcus arrived. "Chef, you need to see this," Mike said grimly, ruining the tape. Marcus watched in horror as the scene unfolded on the monitor. He saw Rachel's discriminatory behavior, the long waits she forced on his mother, and then, the moment that made his blood boil, the deliberate act of spitting in his mother's food. His hands gripped the back of the security officer's chair, knuckles turning white. The same hands that had learned to cook by helping his mother prepare dinner every night while she took a brief rest between her two jobs. The same mother who had sacrificed everything to put him through culinary school. "Pull the footage from the dining room," Marcus commanded, his voice tight with controlled anger. "I want to see everything." The dining room footage showed Sarah sitting alone, maintaining her dignity despite the obvious mistreatment. Marcus watched as she took small bites of the contaminated food, his stomach churning with rage and sadness. "Get Rachel in my office. Now." His voice was quiet but carried an authority that sent Mike rushing to comply. In the kitchen, Rachel was laughing with another server when Mike approached her. "Chef wants to see you in his office immediately," he said. "What's this about?" Rachel asked, rolling her eyes. "I'm in the middle of service." "Now," Mike repeated firmly. Rachel made her way to the office, rehearsing excuses for any customer complaints. She had no idea that her world was about to turn upside down. She entered Marcus's office, finding him standing behind his desk, the security footage paused on the screen behind him. Her eyes widened as she recognized herself in the frozen image. "Do you know who that woman is at table 23? Marcus asked, his voice deadly calm. Rachel shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant despite the growing knot in her stomach. "Just some woman who probably can't afford." "That woman," Marcus cut her off, "is Sarah Thompson. She worked 2 jobs for 15 years to put her son through culinary school. She taught elementary school during the day and cleaned offices at night. She went without so her son could have the best education possible." Rachel's face began to pale as realization dawned. "That woman," Marcus continued, his voice rising slightly, "is my mother." The color drained completely from Rachel's face. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. "I watched you spit in my mother's food," Marcus said, turning the monitor so Rachel could see herself in the act. "I watched you treat her like she was less than human, all because of the color of her skin." "Chef, I didn't know," Rachel stammered. "That's exactly the point," Marcus interrupted. "You didn't know she was my mother. You didn't know she's on the board of this restaurant group. You didn't know she's donated millions to culinary education programs. But none of that should matter, should it? No human being deserves to be treated the way you treated her." Marcus reached for Rachel's employee file on his desk. "You're terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you out." As Mike stepped into the office, Rachel began to cry. "Please, I need this job. I have bills to pay." "You should have thought about that before you decided to serve hate with your tables," Marcus replied. "But this isn't over. My mother is still sitting out there, eating food you contaminated. We'll be reviewing all security footage from your previous shifts, and you'll be hearing from our legal team." As Rachel was led away, her sobs echoing down the hallway, Marcus took a deep breath. Now came the hardest part, telling his mother what had happened, and ensuring that such an incident would never occur in his restaurant again. In the dining room, Sarah Thompson dabbed her lips gently with the napkin, trying to ignore the strange taste that lingered in her mouth. After decades of experiencing discrimination, she had developed an almost sixth sense for when something wasn't right. But even she couldn't have imagined the true extent of what had happened to her food. The restaurant had grown busier during the lunch rush, with the gentle clinking of silverware and murmur of conversations filling the air. Sarah noticed Rachel continuing to serve other tables with enthusiasm, while deliberately avoiding eye contact with her. It was a familiar dance she had seen countless times before. Sarah reached for her water glass, which had remained empty since her first sip. She had watched Rachel refill glasses at nearby tables multiple times, each time pretending not to notice her subtle signals for a refill. Taking a small notebook from her purse, she began to write, as she had done throughout her life when faced with moments of injustice. "Mother," a familiar voice suddenly spoke beside her table. Sarah looked up to see Marcus standing there, still in his chef's coat, his face a mixture of love and concern. She hadn't expected to see him during lunch service, and something in his expression told her this wasn't a casual visit. "Marcus," she said softly, noticing the tension in his shoulders, "is everything all right?" Marcus pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, reaching for her hands across the table. Mom, I need to tell you something, and it's going to be difficult to hear. Sarah's heart quickened, but her face remained composed. She had raised this boy alone, and she knew every nuance of his expressions. Whatever he was about to say was serious. We need to get you to a doctor, Marcus said quietly, trying to keep his voice steady. There was an incident with your food. The security cameras caught it. As Marcus explained what Rachel had done, Sarah's expression remained surprisingly calm. She listened without interrupting, her hands steady in her son's grip. When he finished, the only sign of her distress was a slight tightening around her eyes. I've already called Dr. Williams, Marcus continued. He's waiting for us at his office. I've also contacted our lawyers, and Rachel has been terminated. Sarah took a deep breath, then spoke with the same measured tone she had used to calm countless troubled students over her teaching career. Marcus, while I appreciate your concern, I don't want to press charges. Mom, what she did was assault, Marcus protested, his voice rising slightly before he caught himself and lowered it again. It was a hate crime. I know exactly what it was, Sarah replied, her voice firm but gentle. I've experienced hatred in many forms throughout my life. But pressing charges won't change her heart. It won't address the root of the problem. Marcus stared at his mother, amazed once again by her strength and wisdom. Even now, faced with such a horrible act of discrimination, she was thinking about the bigger picture. What do you want to do? He asked, knowing his mother well enough to recognize she already had something in mind. First, yes, we'll go see Dr. Williams, she conceded, always practical about health matters. But then, I want to meet with Rachel. Meet with her? Marcus couldn't hide his surprise. Why would you want to do that? Sarah picked up her notebook, showing him what she had been writing. Because sometimes, the only way to combat hatred is with understanding. I've been thinking about how many young people like Rachel have never had to face their own prejudices, never had to really see the humanity in those they discriminate against. She closed the notebook and placed it back in her purse. Besides, she added with a small smile, I spent 40 years teaching children to be better people. I'm not about to stop now just because I'm retired. Marcus helped his mother stand, feeling a familiar surge of pride and love. As they walked toward the exit, other diners watched curiously, unaware of the drama that had unfolded or the lesson in forgiveness and dignity they were witnessing. Sarah paused at the door, looking back at the table where she had sat. You know, Marcus, she said thoughtfully, sometimes the worst moments in our lives become opportunities to create real change. Let's make sure something good comes from this. Together, mother and son stepped out into the Atlanta afternoon, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, not with anger or revenge, but with the grace and wisdom that had guided Sarah Thompson throughout her remarkable life. 2 days later, Rachel Miller sat nervously in the small conference room at La Maison, her hands fidgeting with a crumpled tissue. The restaurant was closed for lunch service, creating an eerie silence that only amplified her anxiety. When she had received the call requesting this meeting, she had expected lawyers, not a face-to-face conversation with the woman she had wronged. The door opened, and Sarah Thompson entered, followed by Marcus. Rachel immediately stood up, her legs shaking. Sarah looked elegant as ever in a simple navy dress, her silver hair neatly styled, and that same pearl necklace gracing her neck. Please, sit down, Sarah said gently, taking a seat across from Rachel. Marcus remained standing by the door, his arms crossed, his chef's coat exchanged for a formal suit. Mrs. Thompson, Rachel began, but her voice cracked. The shame of her actions had haunted her for the past 2 days, keeping her awake at night. Before you speak, Sarah interrupted softly, placing an old photo album on the table. I'd like to show you something. She opened it to a photograph of a young black woman standing in front of a classroom, surrounded by children of various races. This was taken in 1978, my first year of teaching. Rachel looked at the photo, seeing the same kind eyes that had looked up at her from table 23 2 days ago, only younger and full of hope. That year, Sarah continued, I had a student named Emily. She was a white girl who refused to sit next to any black children. Her parents had taught her that we were different, less than human. She turned the page to show a class photo. By the end of that year, Emily was one of my most loving students. She just needed someone to show her that her prejudices were learned, not innate. Rachel's eyes filled with tears as Sarah continued turning pages, sharing stories from her 40 years of teaching. There were photos of graduation ceremonies, school plays, and countless children whose lives she had touched. This one, Sarah said, pointing to a particularly moving photo, was taken the day I had to work both jobs. I taught all day, then cleaned offices until midnight because Marcus needed new shoes for culinary school. She looked up at her son with pride. Every sacrifice was worth it. I'm so sorry, Rachel whispered, tears now flowing freely. What I did was unforgivable. No, Sarah corrected her gently. What you did was learned behavior. The question is, are you willing to unlearn it? Rachel looked up, surprised by the question. Marcus and I have been discussing changes at La Maison, Sarah explained. We're implementing a new training program focused on diversity and inclusion. We'd like you to be part of it. What? Rachel gasped, looking between mother and son in disbelief. Marcus finally spoke from his position by the door. Mom convinced me that firing you wouldn't solve the larger problem. Instead, we're offering you a choice. Sarah opened her purse and pulled out some papers. Option 1, we press charges for assault, which is our legal right. Option 2, you return to work, but first complete our new 6-week training program, which I will personally oversee. You'll learn about the history of discrimination in the service industry, work with diverse communities, and help develop solutions for creating a more inclusive environment. Rachel stared at the papers, her hands trembling. You would give me a second chance? After what I did? Everyone deserves a chance to learn and grow, Sarah said firmly. I spent my life teaching children that lesson. I'm not about to stop now. But why? Rachel asked, still struggling to understand this unexpected kindness. Sarah reached across the table and took Rachel's hand. Because hatred perpetuates hatred. Someone needs to break the cycle. In my experience, the best way to fight discrimination is to show people a better way. Rachel squeezed Sarah's hand, her tears now falling for a different reason. I want to learn, she said quietly. I want to be better. Sarah smiled, the same warm smile she had given Rachel at table 23. Then let's begin, she said, opening her notebook where she had already outlined the training program. As they started discussing the details, Marcus watched from the door, witnessing once again how his mother's approach to teaching extended far beyond the classroom, transforming lives one lesson at a time. 3 weeks into the diversity training program, La Maison's private dining room had been transformed into a classroom. Sarah Thompson stood at the front, pointing to a PowerPoint presentation while 15 restaurant staff members, including Rachel, sat attentively taking notes. Today, Sarah announced, we're going to discuss microaggressions in the service industry. But first, Rachel has something she'd like to share with the group. Rachel stood up slowly, her hands clutching a paper she had written. Over the past weeks, her transformation had been remarkable. The defensive anger she once carried had been replaced by a growing awareness and genuine desire to change. Last night, Rachel began, her voice slightly shaky. I served a family celebrating their grandmother's 80th birthday. They were African American, and 3 weeks ago, I would have automatically seated them in the corner section. She paused, taking a deep breath. Instead, I gave them our best table by the window. Their joy when the grandmother saw the city lights. It made me realize how many beautiful moments I've denied people because of my prejudices. The other staff members nodded encouragingly. Many of them had their own stories of growth since the training began. The incident with Sarah had sparked a complete cultural transformation within the restaurant. Marcus, who had been observing from the back of the room, stepped forward. That's exactly why we're here. Every guest who walks through our doors deserves to experience the magic of fine dining. Their race, age, or appearance should never determine the quality of service they receive. Sarah smiled proudly at both her son and Rachel. She walked over to a wall where photos from the past 3 weeks had been posted. Pictures of staff members participating in community outreach programs, serving at homeless shelters, and attending cultural awareness workshops. Next week, Sarah announced, we'll be hosting our first community unity dinner. We've invited families from different backgrounds who've never experienced fine dining. Rachel will be leading the service team. Rachel's eyes widened in surprise. Me? But Mrs. Thompson, after what I did. That's exactly why it should be you, Sarah interrupted gently. Your journey can inspire others. You've shown that people can change when they open their hearts and minds. The training session continued with role-playing exercises and discussions. Staff members shared their own experiences with discrimination, both as victims and, sometimes painfully, as perpetrators. The atmosphere was one of honest reflection and genuine desire for change. During the break, Rachel approached Sarah privately. "I've been meaning to ask you something," she said hesitantly. "Why did you eat the food that day? You must have suspected something was wrong." Sarah's expression grew thoughtful. "In my 68 years, I've learned that sometimes the best way to fight hatred is to meet it with dignity. By continuing to eat, I gave you the opportunity to see me as a human being, not just a target for your prejudice." Rachel wiped away tears. "I don't think I'll ever forget that lesson." The afternoon session focused on practical changes in restaurant policies. Marcus presented new seating guidelines ensuring fair table assignments and training protocols for new hires that emphasize cultural sensitivity. "We're not just changing one restaurant," Marcus explained. "We're creating a model that other establishments can follow." Mom's experience, as painful as it was, has become a catalyst for industry-wide change. As the session ended, Sarah watched the staff members gathering their things, chatting and laughing together regardless of their backgrounds. She opened her teaching notebook, the same one she'd used for 40 years in the classroom, and wrote, "Change happens one heart at a time." Rachel stayed behind to help clean up, a habit she'd developed since starting the program. As she stacked chairs, she called out, "Mrs. Thompson, thank you for not giving up on me." Sarah looked up from her notebook and smiled. "Teachers never give up on their students, Rachel, even the ones who come to us a little later in life." The evening sun streamed through the restaurant's windows, casting a warm glow over the room. In just 3 weeks, this space had become more than a fine dining establishment. It had become a place of transformation, where prejudices were confronted, understanding was fostered, and second chances were given. As Sarah gathered her materials, she knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities for teaching. But for now, she could take pride in watching seeds of change take root and grow, one lesson at a time. The community unity dinner at La Maison was in full swing. The restaurant buzzed with energy as 50 special guests from diverse backgrounds experienced fine dining, many for the first time. Rachel, dressed in her crisp server's uniform, moved gracefully between tables, her service impeccable and her smile genuine. At one table, an elderly Vietnamese couple celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary. Next to them, a Hispanic family with 3 generations present shared stories over appetizers. Near the window, a group of teenagers from the local youth center tried escargot for the first time, their faces lighting up with surprise and delight. Sarah Thompson watched it all from a quiet corner, her notebook open on her lap. She had traded her usual role as trainer for that of observer tonight, documenting the success of the program she had helped create. "Mom," Marcus said, approaching her table with 2 plates of his signature dish, "you haven't eaten all evening. Take a break from your notes." As they shared the meal, mother and son watched Rachel expertly handle a moment of tension when one guest made an insensitive comment about another table's cultural dietary restrictions. "Did you see that?" Sarah whispered proudly. 3 months ago, she would have ignored it or even joined in. Tonight, she handled it with grace and turned it into a teaching moment. Marcus nodded, remembering the angry, prejudiced server who had once spit in his mother's food. The transformation was remarkable. The evening's highlight came during dessert when Rachel stepped to the front of the restaurant, gently tapping her glass for attention. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice was steady. 6 months ago, she began, I did something unforgivable in this restaurant. I let my prejudice and hatred guide my actions. She paused, looking directly at Sarah. But thanks to one extraordinary woman who chose to respond to hatred with love and ignorance with education, I learned to see beyond my biases. The room fell silent as Rachel continued. Tonight, as I served each of you, I saw not different races or backgrounds, but human beings sharing the joy of good food and connection. Mrs. Thompson taught me that fine dining isn't just about expensive food. It's about dignity, respect, and creating moments of joy for every guest who walks through our doors. Sarah wiped away a tear as Rachel announced the restaurant's new monthly program. Community unity dinners would become a regular event, offering fine dining experiences to underserved communities and fostering cultural understanding through food. After the announcement, guests began sharing their own stories. A young black businessman spoke about being regularly seated near kitchens or bathrooms in upscale restaurants. An elderly Asian woman described decades of servers assuming she couldn't afford certain dishes. Each story added another layer to the evening's lesson about the impact of discrimination in the service industry. As the night drew to a close, Rachel approached Sarah's table one last time. "Mrs. Thompson, would you join me in the kitchen? There's something I'd like to show you." In the kitchen, the entire staff had gathered. On the prep table sat a beautiful cake decorated with the words, "Thank you, teacher," in elegant script. "We know you're officially retired from teaching," Rachel said, her voice thick with emotion, "but you never stopped being an educator. This kitchen, this restaurant, it became your new classroom, and we're all better people because of it." Sarah looked around at the faces of her students, the servers, cooks, and staff members who had undergone this journey of transformation with her. Each one had their own story of growth and change. Marcus wrapped an arm around his mother's shoulders. "You always said that teaching was about more than just sharing information. It was about touching hearts and changing lives." Sarah smiled through her tears. "And sometimes," she added softly, "the most important lessons come from our most difficult moments." As they shared the cake, laughter and conversation filled the kitchen. Stories were exchanged, lessons recalled, and plans made for future community programs. What had started as an act of hatred had transformed into something beautiful, a movement of change that would ripple out far beyond the walls of La Maison. Sarah opened her notebook one last time that evening, writing what would be her final entry about this remarkable journey. In the end, love and education will always be more powerful than hatred and ignorance. Sometimes the best classrooms aren't found in schools, but in the moments when we choose to transform pain into purpose. 1 year after the incident that had transformed La Maison, Sarah Thompson stood at a podium in the Atlanta Convention Center, addressing a crowd of over 500 restaurant industry professionals. Behind her, a large screen displayed the logo of the newly established Thompson Initiative for Restaurant Equality, TIRE. What began as a painful experience in one restaurant, Sarah spoke into the microphone, has grown into a movement that's changing the face of fine dining across our country. She gestured to the side of the stage where Rachel stood alongside Marcus, both ready to share their parts of the story. The convention hall was packed with restaurant owners, managers, and staff from establishments across the nation. They had come to learn about the revolutionary training program that had started at La Maison and was now being implemented in restaurants throughout the country. Rachel stepped forward to take her turn at the podium. Gone was the angry, prejudiced server of a year ago. In her place stood a confident woman who now served as the program's lead trainer. "I was the problem," Rachel admitted to the crowd. "But thanks to Mrs. Thompson, I became part of the solution." She went on to share statistics from the past year. Over 50 restaurants had adopted their training program, customer satisfaction scores had improved across all demographics, and reported incidents of discrimination had dropped significantly. Marcus then presented the business case for inclusive dining. "Our revenue has increased by 30% since implementing these changes," he reported. "When you make every guest feel valued, they don't just come back, they bring their friends and family." The presentation included video testimonials from restaurant staff who had gone through the program. One by one, they shared their stories of transformation, of learning to recognize their biases, and of creating more welcoming environments for all guests. Sarah returned to the podium for the announcement they'd all been waiting for. "Today, we're launching our national certification program. Restaurants that complete our training and maintain our standards of inclusive service will receive the TIRE seal of approval, a symbol that tells every guest they will be treated with dignity and respect." The first recipients of the certification were called to the stage, 20 restaurants from across the country that had completed the pilot program. As each owner received their certificate and window decal, Sarah couldn't help but marvel at how far they'd come. After the ceremony, during the reception, Sarah found a quiet moment with Rachel and Marcus. "Did you ever imagine," Rachel asked, "that your response to what I did would lead to all this?" Sarah smiled, touching her pearl necklace, the same one she'd worn that fateful day. In 40 years of teaching, I learned that every moment of conflict is an opportunity for education. We just had to be brave enough to seize it. Marcus watched as restaurant owners lined up to register for the program. You know, Mom, you may have retired from the classroom, but you've never stopped being a teacher. You just found a bigger classroom. The evening ended with a dinner that showcased the program's success. The service staff was diverse, the seating was integrated, and the atmosphere was one of genuine welcome. As Sarah looked around the room, she saw people of all backgrounds sharing meals and conversations, exactly as it should be. Back at La Maison the next day, Sarah sat at her old table, number 23. Rachel brought her a glass of water, serving it with the same grace and respect she now showed to every guest. "Full circle," Sarah remarked, smiling. "Full circle," Rachel agreed, then added, "that the circle keeps growing." She was right. What had started as a single incident in one restaurant had sparked a revolution in the service industry. The Thompson Initiative was already receiving inquiries from hotels, airlines, and other service sectors interested in implementing similar programs. Sarah pulled out her trusty notebook one last time. On its pages were the notes, observations, and lessons that had shaped their program. But what she wrote now was simple. Sometimes the greatest teachers are those who never intended to teach, and the best students are those who were brave enough to learn from their mistakes. As she closed the notebook, Sarah looked around at the restaurant that had become so much more than a place to dine. It had become a beacon of change, a training ground for transformation, and a testament to the power of responding to hatred with education and love. The story that had begun with an act of prejudice had evolved into a legacy of positive change that would continue to impact lives for generations to come.